to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
The United States was once hailed as a pinnacle example for democracy, but its credibility has slowly eroded since the turn of the century.
Every camp is more and more entrenched and less able to find and seek consensus.
Since the Trump presidency, that credibility has declined exponentially due to blatant attacks on democracy, financial crises, and increasingly growing political polarization among its citizens.
Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, South Africa has been quite vocal about the double standards, the international norms and values and democracy.
How have domestic issues affected its global credibility, partnerships, and the way budding democracies perceive this deeply divided country and its issues?
There are old paradigms that have to be updated. There has to be an attitude adjustment.
It's not just that it's shifting from one side to the other, is that the shifts are getting wider and bigger.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, how domestic dysfunction affects U.S. credibility. The view from abroad. Today, we're joined by Dr. Célia Belin, Aude Darnal, and Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Dr. Belin is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and an experienced expert in U.S. and transatlantic affairs, with affiliations of the Brookings Institution and the French Foreign Ministry, as well as being an author, commentator, and member of editorial committees. Aude Darnal is a research associate at the Stimson Center's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program, with expertise in conflict prevention, civil society strengthening, and women and youth empowerment in West Africa. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is an MSNBC opinion columnist, professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, and advisor to Protect Democracy. Her latest book, Strong Men, From Mussolini to the Present, examines how illiberal leaders use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power, and how resistance to them has unfolded over a century. Moderating the discussion is Dr. Joanna Gawczewski. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by speakers at Network 2020 events are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the organization.
So my first question is for the entire panel, but I'll address Célia, you first. How do countries in the parts of the world that you study generally view the domestic difficulties in the U.S., including the recent political divisions over the debt ceiling?
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you to Network 2020 for hosting this conversation. This is extremely interesting, as this topic is a recurring conversation that non-Americans have amongst themselves on have you seen what's happening in the US and how will this affect our relationship to the US? Probably nowhere else more than in Europe, where I'm based in Paris, and I look at the transatlantic relations. And clearly, we have, we go from in ups and downs and nervousness of Europeans every time there's a political change in the US, because, and I would say a nervousness that has increased over the years, in particular because by and large Europeans have outsourced their security and their defense to the United States for far too long, and therefore are always on the lookout to try and understand whether the US will always be on their side. So just on that front, I'll give you a few examples of what that means. We've just published a new study at ECFR that you can find on the website, that was a major poll conducted in 11 European countries, just published, that looked at how Europeans feel towards the US, towards China, and what comes across very strongly is that, Europeans believe they cannot always rely on the US for their own defense. So in spite of the fact that we are close to, 500 days into the Ukraine war, US support for Ukraine and for Europe's defense is a reality, has by and large proven extremely efficient and extremely reliable. Still, 74% of Europeans believe that the US cannot, that Europe cannot rely on the US long term. And also 56% believe that if Donald Trump were to return to power, the alliance would be weaker or much weaker. So we do have a sense of dread over the potential back and forth. But one point I want to underline is that a lot of it is because, is also self-integration and self-censorship. So a lot of Europeans are sort of pre-dreading the domestic divisions because they are, you've got a great American democracy that has a lot of output, whether it's on the general media or on Netflix or on Hollywood or on any of these other medias that cross the oceans and come to our shores and explain to us how the political system is or is not dysfunctional. And I think a lot of the partners on the other side of these oceans integrate, sort of over-integrate these elements and try and predict the future. Will Donald Trump be back in power? Will the debt ceiling? When in many other countries, there are many other domestic divisions and there are many other, big question marks, I'm sure, in Russia and in China and in other countries, except we look at them much less and we don't integrate them in our general approach. And so it's just an element of moderation that sometimes we over-interpret every little elements, and there are actually, maybe we can come back on this, deep trends within US foreign policy that do not vary despite the political variations at the top. And some of these trends are also elements that we should look at because they go deeper than just the divisions.
And then, Aude, can you talk about how the African continent views the dysfunction in the United States?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to this event. So I think first it is important to, to acknowledge the fact that we'll have a various range of perspectives from across the continent and within countries, across countries and at the different levels that we're looking at, whether it is at the government's level, the civil society, or the people on the street, But if we look at the elite level, the academics, civil society, and so on, when it comes especially to the debt ceiling deal, I have not heard particular conversations, and it's pretty recent. And even within the United States, when it comes to the impacts of that deal, let's say on U.S. international assistance, it's not quite clear how that will impact U.S. foreign policy, because we know that there will likely be, cuts in some areas where they were supposed to be additional funding. But of course, this will be of interest to African states, especially as the United States and the Biden administration more specifically are trying to strengthen its relations with the continent. But just speaking, I think that there is, we could say that there is a crisis of legitimacy when it comes to the domestic dysfunctions that we've seen over the recent years, whether it was, the attack on the Capitol and, the state of the health of U.S. democracy, but also the political polarization within Congress and the uncertainty of continuity when it comes to the elections. What will happen with the next elections will likely have a deep impact on U.S. foreign policy and on U.S. Africa relations. So all of these issues are of particular interest. You'll have different degrees of, the sentiment will be different, where you go. I think that contrary to some of foreign partners like France, who at the moment has a really, really, negative, there are some really negative perceptions towards France, especially in the Francophone countries. The United States doesn't, has the, let's say, the chance of not being in that same position. And so it has an opportunity to truly engage with African countries and listen to, to their demand, to their interests. And really kind of move beyond just the great power competition. But again, I think that we could say that the legitimacy of the United States on a number of questions, from democracy promotion to whether it is a reliable partner, whether it will remain a reliable partner depending on the outcome of the elections, are of great interest across the continent.
Great, thank you so much. And then now, if I can turn to you, Ruth, how do the autocratic countries view the dysfunction? Probably a little different perspective.
Absolutely. So one thing to note to start off is I am a historian and analyst of global autocracy, and I truly do view the Republican Party now as an autocratic entity. Its methods, its platforms are in sync and often synchronized talking points with the far right parties across the world. And I use the word methods because there was an attempted authoritarian takeover, a violent coup attempt on January 6th. And the GOP has not only not disavowed it, it actually has integrated it into its DNA. 1 year after the coup, the GOP declared the January 6th attack, quote, legitimate political discourse. What that says to me is they are saying that violence is a legitimate way of doing politics, of dealing with political transitions. They have also 1/3 of the House, the lower, part of our parliament, let's say, is composed of election deniers. So 1/3 of the members of the House right now are election deniers. So they've integrated that as well. So this means that countries like Hungary, which has a very close relationship with the GOP has its Conservative Political Action Conference in Hungary now. Tucker Carlson of Fox News broadcast for a whole week. And he would say things, he's gone now, but he would say, should Hungary be our model? So this idea of electoral autocracy, which is fundamental to illiberal regimes and governments, where you have elections, you don't suppress elections, you keep them going, but you find ways to game the system. That's what the GOP is aiming toward. And of course, this builds on things in American history, which is not my specialty, but racialized voter suppression going back to the Jim Crow era, where we had a kind of regional authoritarianism, although it's not often recognized as that. So because of this, the GOP really, if it were an independent entity, its foreign policy, its talking points are part of this kind of far right international. And it was very interesting that right before she took office, Giorgia Meloni, the neo-fascist prime minister of Italy, said in an interview to the Washington Post that she sees the GOP as a kindred spirit. I think she said, they translated it as their ideals and aspirations are like ours. That's very important. And of course, we know all about the numerous ties of GOP lawmakers with Putin. And we can see what's going on inside the US, the attacks against the Department of Justice, the FBI, the reluctance or opposition to funding, Ukraine, all those things. If you place them as a foreign policy, support for the convoys in Canada that were trying to dislodge Trudeau, all of these things add up to a kind of anti-democratic, crusade. So we have in the States, it's Celia talked about dread. I can tell you, living here, we have a bipartisan system. So this is a big liability. And people I talked to, I was on a podcast with former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, who's conservative, and was saying, what does it mean to be a conservative anymore? So there isn't, conservatives they don't foment coups. That's not what they do. Extremists foment coups. So we have a bipartisan system in which one of the two parties has actually exited democracy. So, but there's no other place for people who might want to be elite defectors, as we talk about. There's nowhere for them to go. So this bipartisanship, which was considered a factor of stability, and many Americans said, oh, we're so much better than those other countries that are so unstable. Now it's quite a liability. It's a big problem. So I think the only other thing I want to say is I also look at Brazil very closely, and here the history of the U.S. in Latin America supporting coups, right-wing coups, is having an effect where Lula da Silva, who is a progressive, very much veteran of struggles for democracy, came in after Bolsonaro, and then they had the January 8th insurrection. So he's certainly not a far right person. He has not wanted to embrace Ukraine, in a very stalwart fashion, and he's becoming a client of China. So the bad feeling toward the U.S. Is of course being exploited by China, if we're talking geopolitics, to come in and become a patron or a sympathetic ear or a funder of countries that they never liked the U.S. and perhaps their faith in the U.S. is less now.
Okay, thank you. No, it's interesting because, we think of how different it was with the Soviet Union versus Russia, and that domestically the country was unified. Well, now with the divisions, that is a different factor in recent years than what previous, U.S. democracy versus autocracy. So that is a different factor now. Thank you for pointing that out. And now if I can turn to you, Aude, on the African continent, what are some specific concerns of some of the countries that could have a direct impact on their own governments, and which countries have the greatest concerns?
So I think that, I will echo what we just said. The current political instability within the United States is a liability abroad. I think that this, especially, what I mentioned earlier, the uncertainty about U.S. political future and its impact on U.S. foreign policy towards African states is one of the biggest concerns, I think, across the continent. There has been a number of initiatives that have been announced, for instance, in December 2022 during the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. The U.S. strategy for the African continent that was released in August also set the path for a more ambitious engagement strategy and more ambitious policy when it comes to the continent. However, the question now, I think, is how do you go from, those discourses to practical action? We could also mention the President Biden's statements about the United States supporting the UN Security Council reform back this fall 2022. I think that at the moment, from the conversations I've had with a few intellectuals across the continent, what comes quite often is this idea that at the moment, we do not, there is no, we currently do not see actions behind those words. Many statements have been made, but at the moment, there is still no action that are undertaken by the government. And so it is very difficult. I think it is also in the way that the government, US government communicates, strategically communicates around his strategy and his policies. But at the moment, that is lacking. Moreover, I think that the other element that is quite interesting to monitor is the impact of great power competition, the framing of US foreign policy through great power competition and how that plays out for the continent. I mean, obviously, African leaders will do the best to push forward the interest and kind of play as well, this game and get the interest forward with whatever actor that they engage with. But the question is, how does this framing impact US foreign policy, whether that undermines cooperation in some critical sectors? We could talk about climate security, for instance. We could talk about investments in critical sectors and so on. And so I think that those 2 points, and also coming back to this question of the loss of legitimacy, US foreign policy obviously focused quite a lot on democracy promotion. What does that mean for the continent when US democracy in such a poor state? What does that mean in terms of the policies that it pushes forward through the Department of State, through USAID? What type of legitimacy can the United States have in this context? And I think, those are, critical questions and difficult ones at the moment for US political leaders to address. And what we're saying is that more and more African leaders, but also just the intellectual elites, the civil society are speaking out of this. I mean, I think we've seen since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, South Africa, for instance, has been quite vocal about, the double standards when it comes to, the international norms and values and democracy and sovereignty and territorial integrity. So we are seeing as well, in Senegal, I was discussing with a friend from the civil society, young entrepreneur who advocates for, youth engagements in governance. He was also discussing these issues with his counterparts in Senegal. What is the legitimacy once more? What concretely does the US strategy for the continent translate into action? And that we are yet to see that.
All right, thank you. So you're starting to see really realignments going on on the African continent.
Exactly. I think it's really, it's really that. I mean, from my personal view is that there are ambitious objectives, but at the moment, the question is whether it's just a lack of innovative ideas, a lack of know-how. At the moment, I'm just not seeing translation into actual policies.
As a nonprofit organization, Network 2020 relies on the support of listeners like you. If you're a fan of Global Insights, we humbly ask that you consider making a donation by visiting network2020.org. It's your generosity that enables us to keep delivering the content you love. From all of us, thank you.
And now, Celia, if I can turn to you, because you mentioned briefly about the deep trends in US foreign policy that are somewhat constant. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, and also, are the European allies worried about facing a less reliable, less predictable US foreign policy?
Just on that last point, I think it's been a while now that the US foreign policy is less than predictable, actually. If you look at the major swings in US foreign policy that have occurred, actually, the Trump, the Obama Trump-Biden swing and possibly whatever comes after Biden, whether in 2 years or in 6. These swings are very big, but you also have to remember, the 90s under Bill Clinton, and then the Bush administration possibly only after 9/11, but there's a really big swing in a direction of neoconservative interventionism versus another swing after under Obama, leading from behind, etc. So of course it's every time some sort of degree, a degree more, but the idea of swings is integrated because of the way the system functions, and because of the bipartisanship that Ruth had alluded to, the bipartisanship that has increased with negative partisanship. So now, every camp is more and more entrenched and less able to find and seek consensus. So maybe that's the difference. It's not just that it's shifting from one side to the other, is that the shifts are getting wider and bigger. One of the elements that I wanted to jump back on before answering your question is what both Ruth and Aude alluded to, which is the integration by the rest of the global actors of the constraints of domestic constraints of the United States, including of the US president. Everybody knows by now that if there's, there was to be another climate treaty to be voted on at another new COP or other places, the US would not be in a capacity to vote on any treaty. So global actors integrate some of those constraints and sort of adapt, but also self-center around it. One of the most one of the most damaging elements of those swings, in my opinion, were the decisions that Donald Trump took early on to leave the Paris Agreement on climate change, and then the JCPOA on the Iran nuclear deal, because in both cases, for completely different reasons, it really undermined the capacity to continue to have these global multilateral deals, whether with all the countries in the planet, and then the US, the major player, comes out and everything sort of falls apart, or because it's a multilateral element around, the Security Council members in particular, but then the US is also a central part. In both of these cases, these decisions have been long-lastingly damaging and very difficult to repair. But then, even an administration coming in, such as the Biden administration, trying to mend the situation, saying, reintegrating the climate agreements, but also claiming that the dysfunctionality of the US system prevents them from making still meaningful effort. For example, on climate action, almost 3 years into the Biden administration, it's still highly disappointing from the point of view of many other countries on the outside. The US is still short of now, $12 billion dollars that he promised in providing towards the 100 billion fund that is needed for the climate transition of the global South and many developing countries, when the new sort of climate-friendly policies are all internal and looking internally at developing US economy around green technology, and therefore it's not exactly about helping other countries transition towards a more sustainable economy. So all of this, and these is where we touch on also the more long-term elements of US foreign policy that go beyond the change. The major change, the major rupture, we've talked about them. It's, deciding to intervene in Iraq. It's deciding to get out of JCPOA or getting out of the Paris Agreement. But when you look at what are the trends, 3 of them are very clear, and they go beyond party lines and beyond dysfunction. One of them I just talked about is this sort of reshoring strategic industrial policy that the US has been intent on putting in place both during the Trump administration and the Biden administration is about basically, you know, Biden calls it building back better, and Donald Trump calls it America first. But it's about exercising your economic power and your industrial policy towards your own development, and this has major, you know, global effects on countries, and there's little expectation that this would change overnight. The second one is clearly US-China rivalry that has been, you know, brewing and growing. Started at the end of the Obama administration as to be a prominent, even at the beginning, you remember the pivot, but really growing, and now has taken central stage. No one expects, even if when the change of administration, that this would go away. And the third one is possibly the inheritance, the legacy of the sort of post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan element is the intention fundamentally to try and not intervene militarily in military you know, terrain at no point, possibly because it also goes with the US-China rivalry. Basically, the US is you know, saving its soldiers. That's a terrible way to say that, for a potential major confrontation with China if that were ever to happen, and therefore will be quite unwilling and uninterested in smaller military intervention. I think those are like deep trends that whoever is in power, whoever sits in the White House, do matter and do affect the rest of the world and do not change with a political shift.
Great, thank you. That's fascinating. Yeah, so that, I guess that's some predictability for other countries. So now I will turn to the Q&A box, and there's a question here, and I think I will address it to you, Aude. How are countries in the global South responding to the perceived double standards, hypocrisy of the West when it comes to liberal democracy?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's, I mean, we've heard since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, you know, leaders taking a stand, you know, against those double standards, against what is sometimes perceived as being, you know, bully behavior, you know, trying to impose or however you want to call it, whether it is convince or coerce or impose a particular strategy of communications on the one Ukraine, whether it is, you know, choosing between China, Russia, and the United States. I mean, we've heard it, and I think that currently I took the example of South Africa because it is the one that we've mostly heard since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and there are currently still tensions between the two governments, the U.S. government and the government in South Africa. I think we've also seen it through the votes, the different votes at the United Nations. So there has, again, you know, I want to emphasize the fact that the global South is not a homogeneous bloc. You know, we have different perspectives, different viewpoints on this question, but so, you know, it's been also displayed through the votes at the UN General Assembly. You know, many countries voted in favor of Ukraine, many didn't. Those votes also changed depending on the topic of the vote, so whether it was for the suspension of Russia from the Committee on Human Rights and so on. But just generally speaking, I think that what we've seen, like the change that we've seen recently is that global South political actors, whether it is at the civil society level, at the governmental level, are much more vocal when it comes to their interests. And they will call out the perceived double standards. They will push their interests forward, you know, not simply being dictated what domestic or foreign policy to take. They will continue engaging with their different partners, whether it is China, whether it is Russia, whether it is the United States. Some call it multi-alignments, but some call it just standing on the fence. I think that it's not simply standing on the fence. Countries are taking position. They're taking position for their own interests. I think that's the bottom line. And it is likely that this will only continue growing as a position. I think that we are in a situation where, regional powers, global powers are emerging. It's not just about China or Russia, it's also about India, which is taking a stronger role in the international community and is trying to kind of be an advocate for the global South. It is also about Turkey, which is also growing its engagement throughout the African continent. It's not just, we tend to focus on the big players, but it's not just about that. It is also about South-South cooperation. And I think that the growing efforts that we're seeing in that realm are also symptomatic of that. The fact that, yes, more and more leaders, political actors, stakeholders, intellectuals do want to take a stand for their interests. They are condemning the kind of patronizing stance that we can sometimes hear in U.S. positions, and I think that that's critical for the United States and its leaders to hear, to listen, to understand that this is no longer the unipolar moments. There are a multitude of actors that have the capacity to answer the needs and the demands of African states or beyond, throughout across the global South. And rather than just saying this as mere competition, and trying to kind of cling, because that's sometimes it does feel this way. It's like the U.S. government trying to cling to an old, outdated model, an outdated global order, rather than pursuing such a strategy. It's about embracing it. It's about also trying to cooperate, finding ways, finding opportunities for cooperation, especially because we are, in a moment where the global challenges needs global solutions. There needs cooperation, there needs discussions, there needs lessons learned and shared from the South to the North, from the North to the South, from the South to the South. It's not, you cannot tackle these issues by yourself, even with the greatest military on earth. Hard power doesn't fix these issues. You need you need alliances, you need partners, you need cooperation, multilateralism. And unfortunately, many of the policies and actions that have been taken recently by the US government have been impeding these efforts. So perhaps the bottom line, I think what's important to say is that disagreement is normal. It happens between partners. It happens obviously between adversaries, but that shouldn't preclude seeking cooperation, especially when it's crucially needed.
Right. Thank you so much. That's a very important point about the multilateralism, that the world is changing and America does have to refocus how it does business in different parts of the world, sort of quote unquote business. And in the remaining 3 minutes that we have, I just want to actually move on to what your comments, Celia, were, because the final question is, what is the most important message that the United States needs to send out to counter negative global perceptions? What can it do specifically that could bolster its credibility? So if I can start with you, Aude, on that question.
Yeah, I think that's a critical question for US leaders. I do believe that there is a crucial need to listen to foreign partners, not simply trying to conduct a strategy that is based on assumptions that are quite often wrong. I think it's important to listen to them. I think it's important for US messaging to move away from, again, as I mentioned earlier, the patronizing tone, the moralizing tone as well that we hear quite often. I think it is also important to question that continuous great power competition framing, which, as Celia mentioned, is not helpful for anyone or any global challenges that we are currently facing as a planet. And those 3 points are, to me, capital. I think that the Biden administration has heard those complaints from its partners from across the global South. I think it's been a slap in the face throughout the war in Ukraine, because those countries did not react the way that the United States or the West, frankly, had imagined. So it's been quite a big slap in the face. And you can hear, the change of tone in the rhetoric and the discourses. But at the same time, you have quite, opposition in the discourses. Sometimes from some officials, you can still hear that backward kind of discourses trying to impose views and U.S. interests on other partners. So, I think it's just important to reckon with the fact that, U.S. interests, UN experiences are not that of foreign countries. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it is normal to have disagreements. It is normal to have competing interests that shouldn't preclude opportunities for cooperation. So I think that, and even beyond the messaging, I think communication is important. Strategic communication is important. The messaging, the messages, the way it is conveyed is important, and all of this needs to be accounted for by American leaders. But most importantly, beyond the messaging, is it important that actions follow? Otherwise, it is just empty promises, empty rhetoric, and again, that really undermines U.S. legitimacy and his position as a reliable partner.
Great, thank you. And Ruth, the same question.
Yeah, I have to go in 2 minutes, so yes. I'm just I can't. It's an enormous question. I think I agree that there are old paradigms that work that have to be updated. There has to be an attitude adjustment. I think that it's very, very sad what Celia said, that Europeans are not interested, would not be interested, most of them, in helping Taiwan. I think that reflects the inroads that authoritarian propaganda has made. And I think that if we're going to rely on a brutal, repressive, authoritarian regime, surveillance state like China to solve our problems for the future, we are in truly bad shape. I'm not saying that America has all the answers, but I think as a historian of the total destruction autocracy has brought us, that cannot be the way forward.
Great, thank you so much. And Celia, any final comment?
No, I was just reflecting on what Ruth just said, which is a quite interesting part of the paradox of the sort of the relativism maybe with which Europeans would look at Taiwan is also a question of lack of trust or confidence that the US in the US on whether, as you're saying, Ruth, maybe we cannot really count on an autocratic regime such as the Chinese regime to really cooperate fully, but we need to work with every country. And the US, despite being democratic, has proven time and time again that it's sometimes really disappointing, able to really do what's right only for it and not for the rest of the world. So at the end of the day, one of the beauty and the frustration of the UN and all the multilateral forums is just that countries have to bring their interests and to work together and try and find a cooperative way forward for global challenges, despite their specific regimes, despite these situations, because there is no other There is no other real alternative. And when countries neglect the multilateral forums, it's more competition and potentially more confrontation.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Célia, Ruth, and Aude for a fascinating discussion. We could go on. There's a lot more questions, but thank you so much for participating today.
Thank you very much for organizing this.
Bye-bye.
We can't thank you enough for being part of this episode of Global Insights. To dive deeper into the world of insightful analysis and to learn more about how you can join our community, make sure to visit us at network2020.org.